Right, so today we're looking at the beautiful summer meadow and the buttercups. So the whole composition is divided into two parts. The grasses in the meadow with the flowers, and we've got the trees and tiny bit of the sky. There are loads and loads of texture there today, beautiful little flowers. So the idea for us is to produce the varieties of greens, but not to get lost into details. We might enlarge some of our flowers to make them a little bit more close to us, as we almost like lying in the grass and right in front of our noses there, yeah? But we don't want to have too much tiny details at the back there. We don't want to spend too much time getting lost in them. We want to focus on what's in the foreground, okay? So working on an orange background or yellow background for the summer green type of landscape is one of the most wonderful ways of dealing with greens. So let's start with our sketch. So I have some white, I have some ochre, and I've got some violet, my classic sketching colors. Although everything else is going to be green, these are going to be almost like neutral colors for me to get started to sketch. So let's identify our horizon. So I'm going to use a narrow round brush. I'm going to add some water to my palette first. I'm going to get a tiny bit of white, tiny bit of ochre, and some violet to have a browny type of color. Just going to double check that I have muted you all so there's no extra noises coming through. That's all good. And I'm going to start with, so my horizon is going to be not halfway through my picture, but a little bit higher. So it's not quite a straight line either. It starts a little bit higher. Maybe it dips in a bit more, coming to halfway through, goes up again, maybe it gently goes down again. Okay, roughly something's going on there. That looks quite pinky, this line, but it's actually violety ochre type of browny color. Then I'm going to look how much space I'm going to leave for the sky. Maybe something is much there. And how much space I'm going to leave for the sky here. Okay. There is a part of a fence or a gate as well where this dip within the sky is maybe just a little bit more somewhere that side. So I might just identify it as an interesting detail there across. And I'll put roughly a couple of diagonals for some of my grasses here because they're quite exciting. Okay, maybe this one will just go a little bit low actually, that line. And the flowers, I'm not going to draw them yet. I'm going to roughly just plan some of the maybe, oh, can't quite see it for some reason. Let me just make my lines a tiny bit darker. As on the screen, they're hardly seen. Okay, that's a bit better. Maybe something like that. Again, just gives me an idea of what I'm going to be doing with some of the diagonals, what's going to be happening with some of the lines, some of that structure. And my composition is ready. So I have some emerald green, I've got some phthalo blue, I have some ultramarine blue, any other blues you might have. I'm going to have some fresh, this is going to be my green palette, and this is going to be my yellow browny color palette for my flowers. Okay, it's quite a lot of yellow come out. And I'll have a tiny bit of crimson next to it as well. So I'm going to start with some of my blues and greens. Okay, that's my clean brush now. And I'll use a flat brush to get started for my sky and my background trees. Okay, I'll just make this canvas a little bit bigger. That's it, and let's get started here. Right, so my flat synthetic brush, I'm going to use some white, and I'm going to have some phthalo blue first. Now, sky in the photograph looks very pale, almost white. We tend not to do it white because we have very bold yellowy green type of colors for the field, or even for the trees. So if we make our sky very white, it will look very dull. So photograph is not always picking up a really nice sky color. So I'm going for a pale blue, maybe increasing small amounts of darker blue, a little bit more higher, so I can have tiny bit more darker blue on the top and a bit paler blue going down. Doesn't have to be perfectly even. And I'm also going to use this color almost dipping in the center of some of the, not the center, but the edges of my tree. So if my tree, the line I put quite even, I'm going to deliberately go further into the trees, just in case if we have gaps between our branches, and we already have this sky color, and that will be showing some of the spaces between the branches. So I can go with the green over some of these areas and make the gaps smaller, but at least we're preparing them in advance. Okay, something's going to go there. Nice and easy, nice and steady. And then I'm going to have now our trees at the back, in comparison to the foreground grasses, going to be much more cooler in color. So the grasses at the front are going to have more oranges, more yellows. They will be a little bit paler in some places. The trees at the back, we're going to make them a little bit more cooler. So we're going to have least amount of green in comparison. So I'm going to go for emerald green and some phthalo blue. So that's a very cold color. So I do need a little bit of, let's say, ochre here. Okay, so that's a little bit more of a cooler type of green. But it's not super warm and not super sunny type of green. And let's get some of the further away trees. Tiny bit more water for my brush so the paint is not drying too quickly. I'm going to just dab into the edges of my trees so I can see a bit of sky left. Nah, a little patch. If I were to leave a little bit of green, orange background, that's okay. Give it quite a nice feel for it. I'm going to have a darker tree here, so I'm not going to go too far ahead with this paler, cooler green first. So that might be roughly somewhere there. So I'm going to top up my green color, and let's see where similar color could be on this side of my sky. I think this one is actually quite pale. and I can't quite see it against the sky. So maybe I'll need to make part of my sky a little bit darker, or maybe part of my tree tiny bit darker. I think I'm going to go and make my tree tiny bit darker. If I'll need the skylight, I can always do that one, but at the moment I don't want to make the sky too light. So let's just dab gently some paler color first to have the edge of the tree, just to show how it is coming up. If you're not too sure about how big the shapes should be, go for larger shapes first, and then kind of make the segments coming out into the sky area afterwards, slower, building up those shapes. And then this area could be all more or less painted. Okay, that's more or less staying as it is. It's good going.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi, it's Margaret. How do you achieve, what did you get for that darker green? What have you done to it compared to the green on the left?
I've just used the same colors. So I had my emerald green and phthalo blue. I just increased more amount in comparison to proportion of white in the same. So it's the same color. I just made just added less white to it, and I also had some ochre there. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
So just to make it a little bit more greener rather than cooler blue. Very good question. So all I'm doing now as well, just topping up the same two colors. I have my ochre here from a different palette. I'm just going to make it tiny bit more darker, a tiny bit more into the blue side darker. So I made it more phthalo blue, and that proportion again changed slightly. And I'm going to do some darker trees now. So the darker.
Julia, it's Gaynor. I can kind of understand where Margaret's coming from. Does it depend on your phthalo blue? Because I'm struggling to get anything quite as dark as you have.
You should have the same phthalo blue darkness as mine. Maybe just wipe your brush and make sure maybe there is no white in it, or hardly any white in it. Sometimes white can dominate, or sometimes too much ochre could make the whole colors quite light. So maybe clean the brush and start from emerald green, phthalo blue, and you'll have quite a dark color. So if I'll just put it fresh, it just immediately makes it quite dark. Yeah.
Super. Thank you very much.
Okay, you're very, very welcome. And then you can just gently add a bit more ochre. And if it's too dark, still you can add a tiny bit of white, but you might not need much white at all. I think whatever white I had, I probably just run out of it now, and maybe I don't have it at all now on my brush. Good. All right, so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to put for the front tree very dark colors, and I'll work on it with some lighter colors afterwards. So I'm going to have a way darker area here. I'm using the strokes, which might remind me the direction of the branches, the kind of spreading across on the left, a little bit more on the right. So it's not just painting a fence, trying to have a rough, even if I'll leave a little gaps of those orangey marks, even if I can't quite see the exact strokes, overall they are there. And when we'll be topping up our color with let's say lighter tones, right, okay, that's where I can top up my paint again with tiny bit of white, so I can start seeing slightly more difference in the colors. So when I'm doing the strokes, let's say specific direction, they're still there. If I can't quite even see them, they still will start be pronounced once the other layers will start appearing. So I'm adding tiny bit of paler color now again. So maybe a hint of white, which was just on the edge of my palette, maybe a tiny bit of ochre. So it's not a huge jump. I'm going to paint maybe behind my fence here, or if it is a gate. There's a shadow here. Okay, so it's not much of a difference for that color. So I need to come back to my darker color. Okay, I want to paint the shadow here. A few trees casting a shadow here. It's a gentle shadow for now. I can make it darker if I wanted to later. And there's some darker tones coming to the edge of the field somewhere here. Nice and dark area from the top of the tree. So just let's dab into it a little bit more with some smaller strokes, with some larger ones, and maybe go back to some paler ones. So a range of dark tones, varying from slightly darker to slightly lighter, slightly smudgy from slightly bit more identified, more finer ones, where we can see the edges, we can see a little bit more definition, and where it is slightly disappearing. I'm going to try to make them slightly different as well, so they're not all having similar sizes if possible. Okay, I quite like this corner now. So let's come back maybe to the left-hand side. Don't worry about finishing the whole surface for the trees at the back. Maybe just work on one area, maybe just on the left-hand side, or maybe just in the central area, maybe just on the right-hand side. So you're not rushing, but you are focusing on the variety of darknesses. So I'm going to increase the darkness of my shadows of the trees now, especially here in the center, by using more blue. Just going to add more phthalo blue to the same color mixture I had. And I'm going to dab it. Okay, that's somehow gone very pale. Let's come back and make it darker. I'm going to dab it. My flat brush gives me some beautiful, almost like layers. How so the central tree probably got some flowers in it. Looks like something pale on it. So if I'll just dab it, and the flowers kind of spread around those big branches, how they're hanging off the tree. Maybe slightly bigger, maybe slightly smaller, behind some of that orange color. I'm going to keep it darker at the bottom. I'm going to keep it a little bit paler at the top. Some clothes here at the bottom for the fence as well. And I'll also work this, come out a little bit more of a squarish shape. Let's just add it a little more texture on the top. Okay. And to touch up my trees, I will also need, actually, let me give you a moment to get on with your trees to this stage first. Right, so what I'll do now, I'll add to exact same colors I just been mixing, some white, some very pale change to the colors. There wouldn't be much yellow in it because we're going to be painting the lighter branches which have some flowers. So the flowers are white, so we're not going to add any yellow to this. I'm going to again use my flat brush to try to get that effect. I think I need a tiny bit more white still. So I'm going to try to, okay, maybe too bold. I'll mix the paint really well, so the more paint will come out from my bristles and just looks a bit more gentle. So I'm going to try to get those big shapes of the branches, which are some of them going towards us, some of them going sideways. How the branches with the flowers hanging. Okay, maybe a bit more higher. There will be a bit more lighter, a bit more bulkier, and towards the bottom there will be disappearing, or they might be just in the shadows. That's why we can't see them as much. Okay, so I've got an effect of a tree with some flowers, and on the higher branches I can now start topping up some even paler bluey green color. If it start looking a little bit too similar in lines, I might need to mingle it a little more so it doesn't look like a haystack. I don't want a haystack, I want a tree with some blossoms. But I don't want to have too much detail, so my strokes are quite smudgy because it is in a distance, that tree. Okay, and I think I can make one of my trees at the back a tiny bit darker as well to set off some shadows here as well. But that will depend if you already have done it or if you need to touch it up. And I think I just need to touch it up a little. So then my tree at the front stand out a little bit better. So I'm just gently repainting area as it didn't have enough texture there. It was just a little bit blank. And then I was losing the shape of my main tree here. Okay, that's looking slightly better. So yeah, very impressionistic approach, very playful approach. Right, because we have a lot of orange and it's difficult to judge if we've done our trees well or not, because this orange in the foreground really interacts a lot with what we already done. So the plan is now going to be to try to introduce some of our foreground colors, some of our flowers, just to have a feel if we're on the right track here or not, and maybe come back to our trees if needed. Once there is a connection with the foreground. Right, so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to add to our green colors some fresh cadmium yellow. I just picked it up from my other palette. And I'm going to make a fresh emerald green, mix it with cadmium yellow, have a very different green to what we used before. We can have some extra white here as well to have quite a bit of lemony yellow type of effect. Okay, so let's just make some very sunny yellow type of green. Okay, this is going to be the boldest green for our foreground. So we want to have it fresh before we started in some shadows and medium tones. So I'll have extra water on my palette when I'm mixing this color, as I'm going to go really quick and loose painting some of the grasses. So I still have the same flat synthetic brush. So let's do some big strokes. Now they might be larger than what we want. They might be a little bit more spontaneous to what we want. We want them slender later on. If you're worried about painting over the trees with these new big strokes, just double check that they're dry. So if anything goes wrong when we start painting over a little bit, you can always wipe it off. So I think I'm going to start with some of the strokes coming this way. So I want to have some of the larger colors coming through. Because my orange background is very bold on the screen, my green paint looks like it's illuminating, like an alien type of color glowing. I hope you don't see that effect, but if you do, that's a visual illusion from combination of colors, and the camera is trying to cope with that range of colors in one go. So wider strokes, larger spaces of color covered. I'm going to go for even more white and yellow, and I'm going to paint a little bit more flat area of color, a bit more close to the border of the field where the trees are starting. So I'm just going to paint between some of these grasses with some big strokes. Not quite touching it up because I'm going to probably merge it with the medium tone, so I'm not quite touching that. But that's going to be my lightest area of the field. The closer the kind of the grass is going to be closer to the foreground, we might see a bit of soil, we might have more shadows. So that's probably the area where we'll see the surface still quite pale. And what I'll do here, I'll add a few more highlights of the same very pale edges. And I'll give you a moment to catch up. So with acrylics, if we're painting with acrylics, we can at this stage start introducing some buttercups. Or we could have painted all the gaps slightly darker color, all the greens, and then started introducing the flowers. But just to get ourselves a rough idea where the flower is going to stay, let's introduce some paler yellows as big blocks of color. So I'm going to use around the edge brush. It's a small brush. That's probably going to give me the size of a petal, probably for the larger flowers. I'm going to go for some white, some cadmium yellow, and I'm going to have a tiny drop of crimson. So I'm going to have an orangey background, an orangey color. It's not going to be as orange as my background, but it's going to have a not just a pure yellow or pure white color yet. We want to start with some of the shadows. Okay, that's a better looking color like this. Because it's easier to put fresher, lighter colors on top it will be much more effective. And let's put some key colors. Key colors, so key shapes for the flowers. I quite like, we've got nice dark area for the tree here. I deliberately left it quite plain, so we can put some flowers here. So I'm going to put a couple of petals together to paint the shape of the flower we can see from the back. I can see next to it maybe a flower which is not quite open. I'm deliberately enlarging it. So if you can see hundreds and hundreds of flowers on the photograph, I'm going to enlarge some of the key ones. I'm going to start from the background where we can see them well on against the dark trees. Okay, that's a nice one as well. Very similar approach to painting of these flowers as you would have done it in Chinese brush painting. Couple of strokes. Work with the space you have. Don't try to copy exactly the position of the flowers. You might want to copy the photograph for the position of the petals, maybe the kind of dynamics, how they spread together, but maybe not the exact position. Feel free to move the flowers where it's best for you, maybe in between the grasses, maybe higher or lower in comparison to the other shapes. I'm going to make some more paint so I can work further. So I've got two flowers. I think this group could have a couple of more smaller flowers, so they have almost like little V shapes and then some petals on top. If your paint is looking a little bit transparent, it doesn't matter. On my screen the flowers look quite solid. What I'm seeing actually on my canvas, they quite a lot of texture on them, and I can see a lot of green underneath. So I'm going to let it dry, and I'll come back to top up the color afterwards, so it will look much more solid. I'm also quite keen to do various shapes of the flowers. So there's some smaller ones, there's some bigger ones, there's some tiny ones. So they're not identical in size, they're not identical in how open they are. Yeah. So these are quite nice. These are quite really big. So maybe these ones are really close to us, and let's just paint some of them. Now against the orangey background, we might not see them well yet. These are going to be quite open here. Maybe just two of them together. That's why they look like a bigger group. But it's actually two together. Maybe one flat. All we see is how all the petals are almost on the same surface. So let's just roughly place them. We're not going to try to finish them. We're not going to try to fix them if they didn't quite go well. This is a nice one. Somewhere here, I'm a little bit more diagonally coming across. I'm going to have it quite open. Again, looking towards us. We'll do the middle for it later on. This brush gives me a really nice roundy type of strokes to help with the petals. The flowers are small, we're enlarging them, as I said. However, try not to make them the size of peonies. If you're starting to make them too huge, just be careful. They're not overwhelming. Okay, so these are some of the big ones, but also not forgetting to put some maybe baby ones. I'll keep going with the big ones for now. We will do some dots, yellow dots, to show the flowers far at the distance, but maybe not yet. Once we'll identify more grasses shapes. These are just rough plans for them larger flowers, so we know where they are. Okay, I think there will be another one somewhere here. Maybe some small ones here. The maximum I can do for the smaller flowers at the moment is, you know, the band we've done, the lighter band of green we've done on the edge of the field. I can do some small amount of dots, just a little bit, to show that's the flattest shape of the surface of the field. That's where loads of flowers will be just coming together. Okay, less is more. Maybe I'm putting too many. You can always make more. And my shape's coming out very similar in size. So when I'll start working with the greens around that area, maybe I'll need to vary them. Also, some of my shapes coming out a little bit more like bricks. So I'm not too happy with that. Or I'll need to change the size of my brush. Or I can work with that. I'll kind of look at those shapes when I'll add other greens around and gently change that feel. I don't want the shapes of bricks appearing.
Julia, sorry, it's Margaret again. I'm having problems with my yellow. It seems very transparent. I don't seem to get that solid yellow.
Yes, I have. No, it's on my screen. It looks solid, but on my canvas, it is very transparent.
Okay.
So it's okay for now. Keep it as it is for now, because we haven't worked with our greens yet. We will top up those layers. We'll top them up even with darker colors as well, and with much more paler ones. So don't worry. We're just finding positions. So don't panic about it whatsoever. Mine are very transparent. It's just the screen is actually improving my painting dramatically. Okay.
Thank you.
No problem. Right, so for the shadows, so all the orange spaces, we need to slowly start filling in. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use a similar green. So it's cadmium yellow and emerald green. And I'm going to start adding more ochre to it and more phthalo blue. So I'm going to identify some of the darker shadows. I'll paint almost like paint by numbers, little gaps between some of the grasses. So I'll identify an area, I'll paint it in. I'll identify an area, I'll paint it in. I'll start at the bottom because that's going to be my darkest area. If I'm not too sure, I'll make my paint a little more runnier, maybe even slightly transparent, so it's not super thick green color. And I'll just keep painting those little gaps. Bit of triangle here. I'll try to break them into smaller shapes rather than huge. So if I want to change some of them later, it's very easy. So overall, the colors are different from the colors we have on the trees. We're still preserving our paler greens. If you have a lot of space left and you just ending up painting just blocks, very big blocks of dark green, it's not a problem because you will touch things up with the paler colors on top. You can work with your grasses shapes. What I also do, I'll leave some of them orangey gaps, which might be slight reflections on the grasses. Okay, at the moment I'm not going to go too far upwards. I'll just stay low and paint those gaps.
Sorry, Julia, it's Margaret again. I seem to be asking a lot of questions today. How do you get that green? I don't seem to be able to get that shade at the moment.
So I had cadmium yellow.
Yep.
I had emerald green and some ochre. Okay. So that was my original. So cadmium yellow and green was my original green. Okay.
Yeah.
I made a tiny bit more ochre, and then to make it darker, it's phthalo blue or any other dark blue.
Okay.
Okay. And you can, that's where you can vary it, slightly bit darker, slightly bit lighter.
Okay, thank you.
So you'll end up more of a yellowy, orangey green in comparison to cooler greens on the top. Okay. And what I'm doing with my lines when I'm painting these little gaps, painting more like paint by numbers, color by numbers. I'll continue the gap. So let's say I have a little triangle here. So I'll fill that one in. Okay, just paint it in. And then I'll just continue one of those lines higher and continue another edge, one of the edges higher or lower. So then it starts kind of connecting why that shadow was there in the first place, because maybe it was separated by a grass line, a grassy line, maybe it was a branch, maybe there was something else. So it's start having that feel for the volume of the grasses. When I'm coming to the top, I might start stretching some of the areas a little bit more higher. So when I'm painting the shapes, let's say I'll paint this little gap, I'll immediately stretch it up or down, mainly up for the moment, I think, because down we'll have loads of big blocks of shapes. So it's a creative mess. I'm not trying to make it look like as final shapes, but I'm getting some of the diagonals worked out. Maybe some of the lines will be a bit shorter. Doesn't matter if they're going over the flowers, small flowers or big flowers, doesn't matter. I'm just trying to have a feel for the space. I can paint around the big flowers, those ones which are in grasses. So then I can, they stand out a bit more. I'm still trying to keep some of the orangey gaps, if possible, left. So it's still very much creative mess. Perfect opportunity to reduce the shape of the flowers if you wanted to make them smaller, or if you want the flowers to stand out within, you know, the width of the grasses, or within the shape, the darkness of the grasses. I think I've trimmed a couple of flowers a bit too much. That's okay. I've got a big brush. Maybe I can come back to with the yellow later on to make them slightly bigger. So what I've been doing, without thinking too much, I've been dipping my brush into the green, and part of that green ended up a little bit darker, part of that green ended up a tiny bit more lighter, part of it is a little bit more orangey or a little bit more yellowy or a tiny bit more bluey. So without big intention, by dipping my brush into the paint and adding a bit more water, that color started to slightly change. Because it's different thickness, it absorbs the orange background as well. And because all my green colors on the palette are all next to each other, so if I dip into something unintentionally, let's say into something that tiny bit darker, it's gives me an extra bonus. Okay, this shapes looks too similar. Let's reduce them in size. The top part of the field, you know, the grasses, where we had the band of lighter green. So my darker colors come close to that band of lighter green, not specifically very in a bold border, but it's all grassy ends, or it's paler, softer, tiny bit more darker green, which gives me a gentle merge from the depths of the grasses, the darkness of the whole kind of volume of the field. So it interacts a little bit more naturally. So I filled most of my gaps of orange. There's still quite a lot of peeping through, but that's okay. So I'm going to stop at that. I'm going to give you a moment to work on it as well. So your task for the moment to try to get rid of most of the orange on the field. It doesn't matter if the field will end up a tiny bit more darker like mine. We will be introducing lighter colors. We'll be introducing extra fresher colors, and we'll be topping up the colors of the current flowers as well. So let's finish, maybe have 5 minutes to fill the whole of the field now, and have a softer border with a lighter green band at the top of the field. Okay. Right, so what we're going to do next, while we had a little break, let's have a little break from our greens and yellows. Let's look at the part of the fence at the back. Now, while I was just stopping for a moment, I saw that my fence is looking too high. So I'm going to cover my highest gap I've left. So that's going to be all my trees. So I think my fence will stay for the lower 2 lines. And what we're going to do, we're going to mix small amount of white with a droplet of black and some blue, either the phthalo blue or the ultramarine blue. You can also add a tiny bit of violet to it, but anything grayish color would be fantastic. I'm going to still use my big flat brush because it's easier to do the thinner lines, and Let's just have a look. Is it too purpley, too pale? Maybe a tiny bit more black. The fence doesn't look perfect. It looks like, first of all, it's on the angle, so the left corner is higher, the bottom corner is lower. So I think the top area is quite reasonably dark, although the trees behind it is much darker. So I'm going to just leave it like this. And if my shadows of the trees are not dark enough, I'm going to come back to my greens. So emerald green, phthalo blue, and I'm going to touch up the darkness next to that line. Okay, it looks a bit wobbly. And the gap behind. So now that line is standing out much more stronger. Okay, maybe that's all stop somewhere here. And I can even come back and make my line a little bit more straighter here with my violet and with my grayish tone. But there, the planks of the fence below are a little bit lighter, so I can quite happily make them a tiny bit lighter, so they'll stand out slightly stronger. Okay, it looks too purpley color, so I think I might need to add maybe some more ochre to it, just to reduce that purpleness. Okay, that's too pale still, so maybe a small amount of gray still into that. If the paint is too wet, leave it a moment to dry before introducing a color on top. Otherwise it will not paint over well. Got my third plank, some on the bottom, maybe a plank going vertically, maybe another one, maybe you can't quite see another one. Don't want to paint the part of that fence extremely clear. We want to mingle it with the shadows behind. We want to mingle it with grasses. So for example, on the bottom, I'm going to have maybe a small amount of a shadow underneath of it. And if it's looking too perfect to me, I'll use some paler greens just to put some grasses over that area, just to, again, just to leave it slightly hidden. Maybe some paler grasses rather than darker ones as well. Just the tops of the grasses could stay quite pale. So don't want it to be a huge feature. It's somewhere at the back. It's somewhere there, but it's not hugely important. So I might redirect the attention on some of these grasses, the grasses heads. So I'm using a small round brush with a very pale green with some ochre. So some of the flowers and the grasses will have a bit more stronger, wider ends. And if we'll just blot them in, it will give us a slight attention, slight extra texture, almost like little seeds, yeah? So before they start turning to seeds, they got those gentle pale green. Flowers, right? These ended up very similar height. So I think I'm going to put the middle one a little bit higher. I'm happy with that. Okay. So the fence is there, but it's not too strong now. Just going to make sure that my planks not getting any wide anywhere. Just looking at it, some places they look a little bit too strong, a bit too big. So I'm just painting gaps between them to shrink the width of the fence. And then again, if I work too far, I'll touch it up with my brush, my grayish brush. Okay, I'm happy with that then. That's all good. And we're going to come back to our grasses again. Now what I'll do next, now I had my flat brush where I was painting the fence with all those grayish purpley colors. So without washing it, I'm going to go into my pale green, so the green which has some yellow and emerald green there, and some extra white. So I'm going to have like a grayish type of light green. Some of the grasses will have that almost reflecting type of light gray. It's reflecting part of the stems, the reflective part of the leaves. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to put a quick line here so you can see maybe the color. Okay, so it looks quite pale, like a whitish color, but it is more of a grayish type of green. Okay, and what I'm going to do now, I'm going to work almost like into the highlights of grasses. Now, because we're painting the whole field, to focus on individual pieces of grass, yes, you're going to be counting them straw by straw. You're going to be a bit of a suicidal mission. So what we're going to do, we're going to have an area where we're going to have loads of highlights. So for example, maybe a band somewhere here, a narrow band, where every time we hit a line going one direction or the other, we're going to try to keep some of those highlights in that area. So for example, I've got some lines here, so I'm going to put a line across, another line here. So within that rough band, I'm going to have some reflection. So maybe it's how the light is following through, and that's why it's highlighted in this area a bit more. But I'll try to make them slightly different areas as well, so slightly different directions, so it doesn't look like I'm creating exactly the same pattern. Something a bit more like this. Okay, so I've got a bit of a band coming this area. Got a dark area here, so maybe I'll just put one more here. And you know, sometimes when the grasses are falling one side and the other side, so maybe we can see a little bit of light somewhere here and then might have a bit more of a shadow. Let's put maybe somewhere else tiny bit more of a highlights as well. So maybe a tiny bit more that side. And again, they're slightly smaller further back, so we're trying to have that perspective slightly going, and maybe tiny bit more wider strokes close to us. It is quite difficult to judge how much or where exactly they're going to be. Just place them. Oops, sorry. I wanted to move this one across and everything collapsed. There we go. But now I can touch the surface of the end of my board on my canvas here. So I've got them a little bit more settled here. I still quite like using my big brush for this rather than going very fine, but it's up to you. It doesn't mean that you have to use a very big brush. Okay, loads of lines now. But for next stage, we'll need a smaller round brush. So what we've done so far, we've done some highlights on grasses, done some filling of the spaces, we've done the flowers, then we dragged some of the darkness, filling of the spaces a little bit more upwards to create some lines of the grasses, done tiny bit of highlights. Now we're going to go for some more precise shadows. Now these precise shadows are going to be made from one of your blues, probably ultramarine and emerald green. If it's going to be too strong color, I not normally go for direct fresh color, so I just mix those two colors together. But I had a bit of extra, whatever that previous green was here. So it's not just a pure mixture of two colors. I'm using a medium round brush. I'm going to keep it quite moist so the colors will be runny enough for me to handle it, as I want to have some full stops, some few accents, some character building of shadows. So for example, maybe just watch me for a minute or so you understand what's going to be happening before trying to recreate it. Now, some of the grasses close to us have some strong shadows. So I can see one here coming a little bit more close to us. It's a little bit off focus as well, but I can make it darker. I can work into it a little bit more stronger. Okay, that's maybe one shape. Okay, so some of the grasses might have that type of darkness. And I didn't do a direct through line through it, okay? The grass has got type of nature. It changes, the lightness changes through its length. So for example, if I follow that little stem, the flowers there, or the seeds already, and I follow it, it's kind of mingled up and you get lost. But if I follow it and try to find a little bit parts of it, yeah, maybe it will be just a little dot here, a little gap, something else mingled up, but overall direction is somewhere there, okay? Looks maybe a little bit too strong in darkness. Maybe I'll add a bit more green to this color so it doesn't look too bold. Maybe there will be another couple of darker marks, maybe going similar direction here. Just going to calm this one down a little. It just looks a bit too strong in darkness. Okay, that's better. So there will be some shapes which will be repeating the shapes of the tops of the grasses. Okay, that's come out very bulky. Okay, I like the smudge part, but now I don't. Okay, it's still very bulky, so that will have to go. Let's try to do it a bit more thinner. Okay, somewhere there. So the easiest is to start with bulkiness of some of them, bit of a shadow of the tops, of the larger tops of them, maybe just appearing again somewhere here with a diagonal shape, kind of that triangle. Also could be parts of the shadows in here. And then another part of the shadows will be just little gaps. Our famous term we use, happy dots. So it might be a little mark, a little triangle, a little dot, a little something here and there, a little gap again somewhere in between some of the grasses, slightly wider, slightly smaller. And places might not be too sure where it's going to be. So if I'm looking into the dark area, maybe that's where I'm going to put it. Okay, if this one's ended up a little bit too strong, I think it's quite a nice shape, but I think it's come out a little bit too dark. So I can repeat the same, but maybe with a paler color. So I'm creating that depths. I'm trying to create the depths. If I'll overwork this and have too many dark gaps, I'm going to come back with some lighter pale shapes again and work into them. So this is not my final workings. This is kind of layers which I'm prepared to work into overlap and work again over. So I'm just trying to establish some of the creativeness of my shadows. Quite like this flower, but I think it's needs a shadow underneath of it. Okay, it looks very dark around it, so if I'll have a paler tones here as well. So overall, we're trying to keep darker tones close to the bottom of the canvas. And if we are doing something at the top or kind of middle ground of the canvas, I'm going to try to keep it much more smaller in volume, thinner in lines. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to have a little gaps, orangey gaps filled in here. At the same time, almost going around the band of our pale green at the top of the field. Again, just to show the width. That's the top of the field. This is the actual volume of grasses. Well, yeah, we line down there, or we're sitting in there. So we start seeing a bit more of that space. It looks quite a nice mess at the moment. Yeah, a lot of mess. Sometimes a painting like this, you have to go through a lot of layers without painting precise grasses. A lot of layers, which will slowly start identifying various distances. So messy, messy, messy things before we touch things up at the foreground for bigger, longer grasses. So play with your shadows now. Some of mine ended up very similar in size. When I start doing some larger grasses on top and kind of team it all together from the messy area, I'll try to make sure that they will be those similar darker tones will be gone, hopefully. So while our grasses are drying, we'll gently touch up the sky with some highlights close to the tree borders. Now you might not need to do this. You might be already happy with your sky. If you're not sure, just watch me. Maybe try a couple of dots. If it feels too much, maybe just swipe them off and leave your sky as it is. Alternatively, so I'm using phthalo blue and some white, and I would like to have some contrast on my sky. So I've got a very pale blue, almost not white, but just a very pale version of the blue I had before. I want to create some extra silhouettes of my trees here, and at the same time maybe do a tiny bit more lighter parts of the sky and slightly darker parts of the sky as well. I think I need a little bit more contrast here, so I can introduce slightly darker blue here, maybe slightly darker blue on this corner as well. I think that's will just give it a bit more fresher feel for the painting, more summery look. And some of the borders, going to have some of the paler whitish blue, again maybe to show part of the fluffy clouds. Nice summery day. I managed to go to the sculpture park yesterday, have a gorgeous walk, lie down on the grass on with a similar buttercups, and just watch the clouds just passing by, moving, playing, growing, disappearing. I love watching the clouds, especially a nice sunny day. So that might be my memories of the sky from the weekend. It just makes it a tiny bit more fresher and a bit more exciting. And this corner, I've got loads of pale greens here, so having an extra paler bluey white color will give it a stronger, fresher feel as well. Maybe some smaller gaps here. Keeping some of those lines a bit softer. I don't want them to be too sharp. So if I need to keep my white a bit more diluted, that's good. Also, if I need to have paler whitish flowers on my tree here, now I did some fresher white sky, clouds kind of color. I might just gently top up some of the paler color for the tree. So I'm adding tiny bit of yellowy green to the sky blue here. I'm just seeing if it's going to be too much. Maybe a lighter version would be better. If I'll wipe this one off and just have a paler version. It'll look a bit too strong, too intensive, so it means that I need to make my colors tiny bit darker, or have the same color but diluted. I'll just try. Maybe just on this left corner on the top of that tree. Maybe not gonna go everywhere as I've done the other colors before on the tree. Maybe just have a little hint of highlights so they're not interrupting or interacting too much with the flowers. You know what, I think it's too much still. Okay, it started interrupting with my main flowers, my buttercups. So as much as I want the trees to be stronger, maybe show further information about the trees, the flowers, buttercups are more important, so I think I'm going to keep it as it is. That's okay. Maybe then I'll introduce a tiny bit more of a shadow here. It just looks something needs doing here. Again, you might not need to do it. It's very much specific to the painting you might have already created. So don't rush changing things. Okay, that's looking a bit better. And I need to recreate the shadow back as well, because it looks a very nice dark corner and it just offset the whole field when that corner is there. But when it's lost, the flowers are buttercups. Oh, not taking as much attention. Maybe a darker shadow here as well. That's maybe what it's going to be. Yeah, I think that's better. So my flowers on the trees are going to be just offset with more shadows. I think that's looking stronger there. Good. I'm happy with that one now. Things are not jumping too far. Okay, that looks too pale here as well. Okay, that's good. So if I smudge some of my grasses here, it doesn't matter because I can touch them up at any time. Right, I'm much happier with the trees now. We'll just have a look at some of the shadows that they are looking. The shapes of the shadows are looking good because I've been doing some color matching and color choices. So let's just look at the shapes. So I haven't got some odd looking silly shapes. That's good. And let's come back to the touch up of our grasses here. So the rest I'm going to start working into finalizing some of the grasses. This is something quite difficult to copy. If you get the principle of it, you will be in much better position rather than copying it directly. Now, first I should have said, don't paint anything over the trees because the trees are very wet. So if we're not too sure if it's going to come out well or not, best to leave it till the trees are dry before coming to this area. Okay, however, I'm quite brave and happy to go for it. Right, anything else I need to do here? Yes, I'll need to touch up those ones I've painted over. Again, trying to have different heights. Okay, that's when they're a little bit wet. Okay, that's exactly what I was talking about. Right, I'll have to leave this area to dry because there's smudging when if I need to touch things up. If I'm rubbing things off. Okay, let's leave this area to dry first. Otherwise, it will be tricky to fix it if I mess anything up. Just painting that tree back again. Right, let's work with a large flat brush now. And let's do some big strokes to have the whole picture united. So I'm going to go for our initial greeny color, greeny yellow color. There's quite a bit of white in it as well. Nice big flat brush. So possibly watch me first. Just loading my brush with some paint. I'm gonna go for some of the key lines. So I've got those heads of the grasses at the top. So I'm gonna try to follow some of those stems or some of the groups of them. What happens to them at the front. So I'm going to, in a way, reintroduce the amount of green to cover some over exaggerated shadows. Remember I was talking about some of the shadows were too big. Maybe some few flicks. Get a tiny bit more white. To have a couple of highlights. Now my initial highlights of those grayish purpley colors we were doing are settled in really well, so they don't jump. So the highlights I'm adding now might be a stronger highlights. Okay, if I'm going to just try to see if some of that overwhelming number of lines are getting a little bit more disruptive. My canvases looks pretty good. Right, so I'm gonna go for the flowers. So I'll need my brush. Let's open to my brush. I'm gonna go for yellow and white. Nice, fresh, quite solid. So cadmium yellow with a strong white. So it's not going to be a transparent type of color. And gonna go with some of the petals on the buttercups. So for example, if I've got this big one, I'll just put a couple of highlights on the top of them, and maybe just the tops, corners where the sun is just catching it. I also would like to, some of the flowers I would like to remain hidden. Some of the flowers will start coming a little bit more in the front. Some of the flowers I can add directly in this fresh color if I don't think it's enough. Now I've got new grasses. Okay, this is too much. I think that's will have to go. Smaller one, smaller ones. Let's clutter some of the flowers a little bit more in the center. If your white and cadmium yellow looks too light, maybe a droplet of crimson again will be a good suggestion. Let's clutter some of the flower heads right here, kind of in the center left area of the field, just hiding them behind some of the grasses, just allowing some of the flower heads a little bit more stronger maybe at the back. So I'm not going to do them all lighter. Maybe let's say here in the top right corner, and then just a couple of dots all the way to the right. Just very small little drops there. Maybe something tiny bit more stronger in light. At the top here, a couple of little dots. I'm slightly changing how much white I have, how much yellow I have. So it will be more of a ripple of color rather than exactly the same. Darkness, light. Don't think I'll put much light on the border here. Maybe just right in the corner and nothing else. But then these petals could have extra light to them. Any other petals? So that's when we can add some thicker paint. And if it's still not thick enough, because we're going over the areas, if we introduce new flowers and they stay quite transparent, let them dry and then come back to them when they are dry with another layer of the same color. Start being a little bit more alive. Still very gentle. The three-dimensional effect is happening now for the petals because we have that feel what's lighter, what's darker by introducing a lighter color. Might follow a little, can you see I've got a little bit of a diagonal, kind of a swirl, almost like a path of yellows coming through, and that's might give me an idea of where else I can add extra flowers. As a little group or a couple of individual ones. At the same time, I've hidden the big shadow here, which might have been a little bit too strong. Okay, any other small dots? If I've got too much orange background, some of the orange background little gaps could be filled with some of the flowers. Dots, because they're already light areas, so we know that something could be staying light, but then we can get rid of some of the orangey blobs in a more controlled manner. Right, so just to balance off some of our yellows and greens, I'm going to put a tiny bit of pink in our field. So I'll go for direct white and a droplet of crimson. I think it's pinky violety, so maybe if I'll start with crimson, I might add a small amount of violet, so have a purpley color. So I can see a little flower somewhere here. Okay, that looks very pale whitish, so a little bit more violet and a small extra amount of crimson. So somewhere here, that's we'll just cool it off. Tiny bit more red still. Could go even more powerful because it's so much green around this area. That's a bit better. That's again very distinctive combination of colors. So if I put one pink, or if we put something red in our painting, we need to have 3 little dots of it. So I've got one area, maybe I'll have somewhere here another one, which I can see here anyway. Okay, it doesn't have to be a huge amount, and usually it comes in a triangle. So where that triangle is going to be 1 dot, 2 dot, might be somewhere here, this might be somewhere there. I think that might be somewhere where I'd like to put it. A little triangle somewhere here. Okay, I'll just make this purple a tiny bit more darker. Good. And final touches on grassy stems. So I'll go for some paler greens because most of the stems holding the flower heads are very delicate, very light. So for example, here, this is a distinctive flower and the stem gonna go against the dark background. So I can just drop it down and it disappears. And another one, maybe another one, another one. Some of these ones could come up. Some of them just could be just little extra thin lines. maybe some of the highlights of the extra grass heads, which we might have not seen. I think it'd be quite nice to have some of them tiny bit paler here. So then the flower doesn't stand out on its own too powerfully. Okay, I wanted to touch these ones up as well. My paint is dry here already. Any extra highlights on some of the existing grasses as the paint is drying and some of it is not as strong anymore. Or the same is done with some of the darker greens or medium greens. Little minor things to shape maybe some of the flowers or to take over some of the very busy areas and calm them down a little. Find some of those triangular shapes back, or it's a type of process you just have to keep going till you're happy with it. Making it super busy, we looking at the whole of it again, super busy, and finding that balance and stopping when we're reaching it. I think a tiny bit more darker tone here and I'm done. Don't be scared of adding violet to your greens. If your shadows started to look all similar darkness, okay, these are a little bit too dark, so they will have to stay right at the bottom. All I'm doing is just following my intuition of what's already on the canvas and how I can enhance it or frame some of the grasses. Okay, this is quite a strong dark, but I think that will be an acid to it actually, because when it's a tiny bit dry, I'll put a lighter stroke over it, and I think that will be a good shadow. Right, well, that one's drying just down a bit more here. Okay, let's put that by the last stroke. And let's stop. Ideally, I want it to be dry. But if it's not, let's see what's going to happen. And the same here. Okay, that's quite good. Yeah, let's stop at this one now before it's overworked. So we've got a filled with buttercups finished.